I'm going to be looking at Parisian life during the French Revolution using painting and drawings produced at the time. In particular, I'm going to look at the work of an artist called Louis-Léopold Boilly. But before I do, let's consider briefly some of the many causes of the French Revolution of 1789. Across Europe, people were living longer, and France had become the most populated country in Europe. In 1788, the harvest failed, and this was on top of a long period of increasing difficult conditions for the poor. At the same time, the peasants were becoming emancipated and were seeking to throw off the last remnants of the feudal system. Intellectuals were inspired by the ideas and ideals of the Age of Enlightenment, and they were proposing new social and political structures to emancipate society, and their ideas were reinforced by the success of the American Revolution, which finished in 1783. In addition, the newly wealthy merchants and manufacturers were demanding more political power. France itself was in a very poor state financially because of the cost of the assistance it provided the Americans during the American Revolution, and the French monarchy was no longer seen to be appointed by God, and the monarch, Louis XVI, refused to accept any substantial changes. This is the tennis court Oath by Jacques-Louis David, painted in 1791. Just to explain what's going on here, I need to explain how France was organised. It was divided into estates. The first estate was the clergy, the second estate the aristocracy, who in fact only made up about 2% of the population, and the vast majority of ordinary people were in the third estate, including merchants, businessmen, professionals, intellectuals. And it was the third estate that paid most of the taxes. Now, as I said, the country was almost bankrupt, and the Controller General of Finances called an assembly of notables, that is, mostly people in the second estate, to suggest increasing taxes on the second estate, which they refused, and suggested a meeting of the General Assembly, the Estates General, all of the estates meeting together, which hadn't in fact met for 150 years. It finally met on the 5th of May 1789, but couldn't agree on the voting system, largely because it was the third estate who had the most votes. So the third estate separated themselves. They declared a National Assembly, and on the 20th of June 1789 the third estate met and took the tennis court oath, which is what we see happening here. They vowed not to separate and to reassemble wherever circumstances require until the constitution of the kingdom is established. That is a new constitution. It was a pivotal event in the French Revolution and inspired a lot of revolutionary activity across the country. In August, feudalism was finally abolished. The Declaration of the Rights of Man and Citizen was passed by the Third Estate, and Jacques-Louis David was commissioned later to paint this scene of the historic event, the tennis court oath. Many of the people we see in the painting became or were designated as traitors and were guillotined by 1792. David survived. He supported the revolution. He was a friend of Robespierre. He voted on the execution of Louis XVI and managed to survive through the Reign of Terror. This lithograph is called People in the Castle of Bastille. It's the freeing of the Castile. Following the tennis court oath, there were compromises by the king, but not enough. Rumours were rife, food shortages increased, the troops were called in, the peasants were panic-stricken and seized the Bastille on the historic date of 14th of July 1789, partly because it contained a large cache of weapons, but I think mainly because it was a symbol of royal tyranny. In fact, at the time, it only contained 7 inmates. You can see the French guard are freeing prisoners along with the commoners. Some of the French guards previously had refused to fire on the people, and they'd been arrested and were imprisoned in the Bastille. So this lent the troops, caused the troops to lean towards supporting the people, and some members of the French Guard supported the mob, as we see here. This is perhaps David's most famous painting of the Revolution, called The Death of Marat. Louis XVI had been executed in January, and in July 1793 David's friend Marat was assassinated by Charlotte Corday, and we see Marat in the bath holding a note from Charlotte Corday asking to meet him. She had, although she was a member of an opposing group of revolutionaries, she had told him that she had a list of people who were enemies of the state. So he agreed to see her, told her that they would be guillotined the next week, and thanked her. And she then took out a knife and fatally stabbed him. The reason he saw her sitting in the bath is that he suffered from a skin disease and was continually itching, so he had to spend most of his time immersed in water and had his bath fitted out as a desk. In fact, it's not photographically accurate. The Charlotte Corday left the knife sticking out of his chest, but David has presented him almost as a Christian martyr. The knife is shown on the floor. He's shown in the middle of his work. He was one of the heroes of the revolution at the time, and he's presented as a hero and a martyr. This painting was widely admired by the revolutionaries, and several copies were made. Charlotte Corday was guillotined 4 days later. The death of Marat took place at a time known as the Reign of Terror, which lasted from 1793 to 94. And during this time, what was known as the Committee of Public Safety, led by Robespierre, executed, guillotined thousands of people, including most of his political rivals. The revolution lasted 10 years, from 1789 to 1799, when Louis Napoleon, who we see here, overthrew the revolutionary government and established the French consulate. This painting was commissioned by the King of Spain. He commissioned it as one of the gifts that he was giving to Napoleon, and it shows Napoleon crossing the Alps in 1800. There are actually 5 versions of this work. When Napoleon saw the work, he commissioned David to paint 3 more copies of it, and David painted a 5th that he kept till the end of his life. It is a romantic vision. It's in fact, Napoleon, when he went through the Great St. Bernard Pass, it was a fine day, and he rode through on a mule, and he rode through some days after his troops had gone through the pass. When David was painting this, he asked Napoleon to sit for the portrait, and Napoleon refused. But David was puzzled, because he said he needed a resemblance, because those people that knew Napoleon would otherwise wonder who it was. And Napoleon replied, "A resemblance? It isn't the exactness of the features, a wart on the nose, which gives the resemblance. It is the character that dictates what must be painted. Nobody knows if the portraits of the great men resemble them. It's enough their genius lives on." An interesting idea. He didn't care whether the painting resembled him. He wanted it to express a romantic idea of the hero. I mentioned Romanticism, but really the previous painting was in the style we call Neoclassicism. More of that in a moment. Just to move forward with the history, Napoleon was finally defeated at Waterloo in 1815, and the monarchy was restored, and Louis XVIII became king. However, the revolution had a lasting influence on France and the rest of Europe. It changed the social and political structure of France, ended the feudal system, removed political power from the Catholic Church, and brought new ideas of liberty and freedom, the abolition of slavery, and improved rights for women. The period from 1815 to 1830 was known as the Bourbon Restoration, and the period from 1815 to 1824 was a period of peace and prosperity, although many known as ultra-royalists, wanted to restore the pre-1789 system of absolute monarchy. And in 1824, Charles X became king, and he was an ultra-reactionary, and he started to introduce repressive measures which increased tensions and eventually forced him into exile in 1830, and he was replaced in the July Revolution by King Louis-Philippe. The July Revolution is what we see here: liberty leading the people. 3 glorious days from the 27th to the 29th of July in 1830. Louis-Philippe's reign, known as the July Monarchy, went on till 1848, but I'm going to be going back to talk more about life in Paris during the French Revolution, but I just wanted to end at this point in order to mention the difference between the style called Neoclassicism and Romanticism. This is regarded as the example of Romanticism that is often shown. The Romantic era was a protest and a revolt against the previous period, and I'll talk more about the difference between the two styles on the next slide. It was a time of a major shift in society, and this was reflected in the art and a change from, as I said, from Neoclassicism to Romanticism. Neoclassicism predominated in Europe roughly from 1750 to 1850, and it was fueled by the admiration for antique Greek and Roman art, combined with the intellectual ideas of the Age of Enlightenment. One way of summarising this is to say that Neoclassicism is concerned with reason, that is sense, and Romanticism is concerned with feeling, emotion, the individual's reaction to events, or sensibility, as I've called it here. As I said, the high point of Neoclassicism was from 1760 to the 1790s, and for Romanticism it overlapped and went on till the 1870s. Neoclassicism, the works of art tend to be austere, restrained, objective, and they are a reaction against the previous style of art known as Rococo, which was seen to be trivial and gaudy, and there was a desire to replace it with reason, simplicity and thoughtfulness. But Romanticism took over in England. It was Wordsworth and Shelley and Byron and so on, was works of imagination and emotion and subjectivity. As I said, neoclassicism was classically inspired, and one of the things that fueled it were the new discoveries being made and what was being dug up in Pompeii, newly discovered remains. Romanticism looked back to the earlier times in Europe, not back as far as the classical period, but back to the medieval period and to some extent the Baroque. So the neoclassicism, we often see works that contain either mythological or historical events of Greek and Roman heroism. Whereas what we see with Romanticism, we often see medieval legends and examples of Nate, for example, John Constable and Turner were both romantic artists. And the new representation of nature. So neoclassicism was calm and rational in its tone, whereas Romanticism was spontaneous, moody and irrational. And examples of the neoclassicism would be Pope, Voltaire, Milton, and Romanticism, Blake, Wordsworth, Keats, Byron. In art, in painting, classicism was works by Jacques David and Jean Ingres, whereas in Romanticism it will be works by Delacroix or Eugène Delacroix and Géricault. But let's move back now to the time of the French Revolution itself. In order to bring the French Revolution to life, I'm going to be showing you works by Louis-Léopold Boilly, a French painter and draftsman, a gifted creator of popular paintings. He produced a vast number of genre paintings that document the French middle class's social life. His work actually spans pre-revolutionary France, the French Revolution, the Napoleonic Empire, the Bourbon Restoration, up to the July monarchy. He was born in northern France and was self-taught painter. This is known as, this is called Grateful Hearts, and it shows a wealthy woman who has come to the aid of a poor, or perhaps I should say impoverished family. You can see the husband kneeling, kissing the wealthy woman's hand. Behind him is his wife and child. The child is clutching his mother's skirt because he's scared of the little yapping dog. Now, there is an alternative reading. The first reading is the staircase identifies the building. We know it's the Palais Royal, so the woman would be then the Duchess of Orléans, who was known for her charitable work, which is what we see illustrated here. However, you can read the painting another way. Look at the man's knee. It's thrust between the woman's legs, and she has a pleased, slightly flushed look, which implies a different reading of the painting. Note that the previous painting was 1790, so that and this painting were painted after the French Revolution, the year following. This is two young women kissing, and was typical of the type of painting he produced during his early years in Paris. We see two young women locked in an amorous embrace. The taller of the two, slightly dishabillée, wears a white dress which has slipped from her shoulders, revealing her breast. This blatantly sexual scene resulted in him being called before a Republican Council of the Arts, and he was accused of painting a picture of revolting obscenity to Republican morals, the obscenity of which dirties the walls of the Republic. And so he must have, this sort of painting must have been popular at the time, but wasn't approved of by the Revolutionary Committee. But nevertheless, he kept his head and continued to paint. Here's another example. In this painting, two women are innocently comparing the size of their feet, but of course at the same time they're exposing their legs and breasts to the viewer. This type of painting was very popular in the French market at this period, and it was, some of the works he produced were commissioned, some he produced speculatively, and his technique, as you see here, was extreme detail. You can see the on the table there's like a miniature still life, a bottle, a beaker of metal, the shoe arranged on the table. And so it's as much about the art of representation as about eroticism. And it was this combination of craftsmanship and eroticism that appealed to his audience. And in fact, it was Boilly who originated the term trompe-l'œil, which literally means to fool the eye. And it's the term that is now widely used to describe paintings that look photographically realistic. At the height of the Reign of Terror, Boilly was condemned by the Committee of Public Safety because of the erotic undertones of his work, and he escaped the guillotine. We're not sure how, but we think it might be because he quickly painted the following painting. Boilly's work was condemned as shocking obscenities, and it was said that he should be burned at the foot of the Tree of Liberty. It is said that he was warned about this by one of his colleagues, and he painted this painting, The Triumph of Marat, in record time. And it's thought that this was in his studio at the time they came to arrest him, and that the painting saved his life. However, art historians have questioned this because we know that it was painted with careful planning, and there's 3 different compositions that he tried. So he didn't. It wasn't a painting that was rushed to completion. But we don't know whether it was motivated by his inclination or out of terror to avoid the guillotine. It's the first time actually that he painted such an elaborate multi-person composition, and it was this sort of composition that later came to characterize his work. He is in fact in the painting, if you look to the right of centre, the figure looking out at us with the red cap is thought to be a self-portrait of Boilly. And to some extent this recalls the David painting we saw earlier, Oath of the Tennis Court. What happened was that Marat was accused in 1792 of using his newspaper to undermine the convention. A crowd gathered in the courtroom, and Marat addressed the crowd and was quickly acquitted, and then the crowd climbed over the barriers and hoisted him onto a table and festooned him with wreaths and palms, and he was carried triumphantly through Paris. This is not a crowd scene, it's a single individual It's painted a few years later. It's interesting because he uses chalk, black and white chalk, with touches of white body colour in order to imitate a print. Is showing off his technique and his ability to demonstrate how he can capture subtle diffuse lighting, the textures of the various materials, the bottles, the metalwork, the chair, the drapery and so on. It's called A Young Girl Holding Her Dog, and there's another painting of the same subject called The Beloved Dog, and an engraving entitled The Lazy Girl. Perhaps because we don't know who she is, but she's living in a bit of a mess. I don't know whether the mess is there to illustrate Boilly's ability to paint so many different objects, or the intention is to show that the girl is lazy and that the mess reflects her moral behaviour. It's a painting that owes something to the Dutch artist Jan Steens. This is a painting displayed at the Academy in 1798 called The Meeting of Artists in Isabe's Studio. It shows 31 famous contemporary artists, performers and writers. We know the names of nearly everyone in the picture, and it's an interesting picture because it combines the style of a grand history painting with the accurate portraiture of a genre painting, then the lowest form of art. So it's combining the style of the highest form of art with the lowest. I won't go through all the names of all of the artists there, but the two I'll draw your attention to is Isabe himself is on the left looking at a painting, and the figure that I've circled on the right is a portrait of Louis-Léopold Boilly himself. This is a detail of the painting just to show you how realistic the portraits were. It caused a sensation in the Paris Salon. People pushed each other aside to point out painters, architects and other artists that they could identify. Boilly was aware of what the reaction that this would cause, and he placed a number of small portraits around this painting, and instead of the sitter's name he gave his address and the price of 120 francs so that people could contact him and he could paint a copy of the artist or architect they were interested in. It made his name, and that enabled him to receive commissions for much larger canvases and more complex commissions and compositions. He was the first artist to show Parisian street life, but unlike Hogarth, he doesn't engage in satire but in documentary recording. So his work shows us how after the revolution the various social classes were thrown together. Boilly painted literally thousands of portraits. Here's one of Madame Louis-Julien Gouin, her son and her stepdaughters. He was a fashionable portrait painter, and he boasted he could complete a head and shoulders portrait in 2 hours. What we see here is a fashionably dressed woman in an Empire Line gown, and unlike his earlier work, there's no eroticism. It's a family scene, children's books and toys, including a box containing leaves and a beetle. We see that she's the second wife we know of a colour merchant, and although he isn't present, she's showing us a locket that she's holding between her fingers, presumably containing his portrait, and the boy is looking adoringly at the portrait. One of the stepdaughters of his first marriage looks at her stepmother adoringly, and the other appears to be looking at a bee that's in front of the screen. Another example, perhaps his most successful portrait, is called Portrait of a Lawyer. In his lifetime, he produced some 5,000 portraits, nearly all the same size, 22 by 17 centimetres, and he claimed he produced them in an incredible 2 hours, and he charged a modest 120 francs. This shows the lawyer wearing his business attire, which is unusual. Most of his portraits are sitters wearing plain jackets, and this is a time, 1800, when the male dress was becoming increasingly modest and female attire was becoming more elaborate. It was switching around. Boilly painted military officers, businessmen, politicians, actors. He painted everyone. He produced them, he joked, almost as a military operation, and he described them as his service record in painting. This is the arrival of the stagecoach in the courtyard of the Messagerie. It looks like a conventional painting of a street scene, conventional to us, but at the time it was the earliest painting in France of everyday street life. Boilly is regarded as one of the first painters of modern life in France. It's an urban scene. It shows the arrival of a stagecoach and the different classes of people and the way they're interacting. You can see that a couple are kissing in front of the stagecoach. One of them has just got off the stagecoach and is arriving in Paris. We know from the sign on the wall that this is the location where stagecoaches from northern France and Belgium stopped. And in fact, the person kissing his wife is another artist, a friend of Boilly. So we know that this was produced from sketches that were done from life. On the stagecoach, there's an old woman waiting to get off. On the left, there's a soldier kissing or attempting to kiss a flower seller who's turned her head away, looking at a young officer who's looking at a man kneeling in front of him. This type of painting, as I said, was very new type of painting, but it is based on 17th century Dutch painting, which often showed these sorts of street scenes, genre scenes, but very new, very original in France. He painted it in 1803, and it was displayed in the 1804 Paris Salon, where he hoped to find a buyer. It wasn't painted on commission. And although it received good reviews and was greatly appreciated, he didn't actually sell it until much later. And we see here, this is typical of his later style. As I said, in the Ancien Regime, before the Revolution, and in the early part of the Revolution, he painted amorous subjects in the northern tradition, but after he almost was guillotined, he switched to different subject matter and turned to portraiture first of all, and then later to these what could be to group portraits, like the gathering of artists in Isabelle's studio. And then this is one of the first depictions of urban life in this genre scene. This is My Little Soldiers of 1804. Boilly continued to paint portraits in this period, and here he's painted his 3 sons from his second marriage who are playing at soldiers. Julien is the one carrying the drum and adjusting the pose of the younger brother Alphonse, and on the left is Edouard, who watches his older brother with a mixture of awe and admiration, while the family dog stands to attention on the left of the picture. It was exhibited at the Salon of 1804 and was well received by the critics. Other painters at this time were representing battle scenes to glorify Napoleon, whereas what Boilly is doing here is contrasting childhood innocence and the very real possibility that these children would be going to war in a few years' time. This is a group of people of a mixture of different social classes who've come to see the public viewing of David's coronation at the Louvre. Boilly has included himself on the far right. I've put a circle around his face. In the background we see what they've all come to see, the famous painting by Jacques David called The Coronation of Napoleon at Notre Dame. And it was the painting by David was completed in 1807, and this is a record of the when it was shown in public and the people who came to see it. David's painting is a very large painting. It's 10 meters wide and 6 meters tall, and it's held displayed in the Louvre. David had become the official painter of Napoleon Bonaparte, and this painting in the background was commissioned in 1804. The painting by Boilly shows, as I said, a mixture of classes. We see a military officer who is identifying the various figures in David's painting, and there are various other portraits scattered amongst the spectators. It was exhibited at Galerie Lebrun in Paris in 1826, the first posthumous retrospective of works by David. Another painting inspired by the Dutch artist Jan Steed. This is a courtyard outside an inn, and the people there are playing a game called the barrel game. The barrel game consists of throwing discs into holes in a barrel, or as we see here, a tabletop. Sometimes you had to throw the discs into the mouth of a carved frog. In a lot of Boilly's crowd scenes, the interesting bit is to look around at all the incidental detail that brings it to life. On the far right we see a young child with his foot on the step, leaning forward to take an apple from the woman. In the centre, in the background, there is a young woman who kissing, but it looks as though she's restraining herself, pushing herself away from a soldier's unwanted embrace. In front of them there are two women arguing with a man sitting round a table, and behind them there's a man urinating against the wall. On the left, the man with the surly look and the hooked nose is typical of the sorts of characters that Boilly increasingly depicted, angry, strong characters. And it looks here as though, if we look at the three figures on the left and the three figures to the right of centre, it looks as though there's two groups who are competing here, and if something goes wrong with this game, if the disc doesn't go into the hole, it looks as though a fight could break out. In other words, there's a lot that can be read into this painting, a lot of possibilities implicit in the characters shown. I'm showing this drawing called The Polecat because 7 years later he produced a painting with the very similar to this, with the same sort of characters but with some interesting differences, and I'll be showing you the painting next. But just look around the figures who are watching a Punch and Judy show here. The woman next to Punch and Judy is no longer interacting with the wealthy woman in front of her in the painting, and the small boy we see who's holding the dog is in the painting appears to be pickpocketing. Let's have a look. Boy made a fortune from his lithographs, from reproducing his work as prints. And this looks like a print, but it isn't. It's demonstrating his skill. It's a black and white painted picture imitating a print, and referring to his love of 17th century Dutch painting, and of course demonstrating his own skill, which we see in the various objects, the telescope that the boy is looking through, the foreshortening of the telescope through the drapery of the young girl, and the bowl containing the two goldfish with the light behind it, illuminating the goldfish. There's also an antique frieze below that he's painted, and a canary in the cage above. This was painted in 1832 when he was 71. It's the most complex composition that he has attempted before. There's something like 70 figures altogether in this, and this reproduction doesn't give convey sufficiently the detail in the painting. So I've got two more enlargements of parts of the painting to show you what's going on. There's all sorts of carnival characters. It's called a carnival scene, with some people dressed as apes, some as Pierrots, some as harlequins, some nuns, some devils, and so on. There's even a dog with a mask hanging on its tail at the foreground centre. This gives you some idea. The painting is flawless. The detail is remarkable. You can look closely at the painting and see everything that's going on, all the people's expressions. And what we see here, at first sight, it looks as though the faces are a bit stilted, but we see many of the faces are actually masks. You can see that the chap in the centre, wearing the light blue jacket, has got a mask on which is flesh coloured and tied with thin ribbons. The woman next to him is also wearing a mask. There's a dog leaping in the front with a mask tied to its tail, a boy blowing a horn, and interestingly there's a fat lady, or possibly it's a man dressed as a woman, climbing into the coach in the middle, and her skirts are blown up to reveal her bare buttocks. And amusingly, Boilly has emphasised this point by showing her bare buttocks alongside the point of a soldier's bayonet. You can see people in carriages in the distance straining to see what's going on. It's a street scene that Boilly knew well, as we can identify the place, and we know that he lived close by here. He'd lived a long life. He died when he was 84. He'd lived through the French Revolution, managed to survive, seen a number of regime changes. His style, as I pointed out, had changed, but throughout it all, he continued to represent the everyday life in Paris during this period.